On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Anwar Reddick. He is the Director of Information Security at Greenlight Financial Technology. We're going to have an episode where we're going to talk about build versus buy in the security space. Anwar has a really interesting background, software engineering, development experience, and he has a slightly different perspective on build versus buy, and I'm excited to have him on talk to us about that. Anwar, thanks for being on.
Mayor, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I guess let's start at the top. Let the listeners know, what your responsibilities there look like at Greenlight, and also what does Greenlight do?
Sure. So, Greenlight is a family fintech company on a mission to help parents raise financially smart kids. And so we build technology products that are comprehensive all-in-one money management platform that is purpose-built for families that offer a full suite of financial services across earnings, savings, spending, giving, and investing. And I know that was a mouthful, but we basically have a parent-managed debit card accompanied with Android and iOS mobile apps. Those apps are backed by our backend services that we host. And those apps include educational resources and money management tools that parents use to raise financially smart kids.
Awesome. It sounds like, when I was kind of looking at your background and what Greenlight does, I mean, that could be a whole episode in terms of the complexities of security just within the context of what you guys do. And maybe we'll have you back on and do a part two at some point. But I think, really curious in terms of your responsibilities day to day in the context of security. Kind of give us the high level of what you're responsible for when it comes to that area.
Sure. So, it's pretty broad. I manage the security program and the security team, which is growing. It encompasses protecting the product, protecting our digital interests, security audits from external auditors for compliance purposes and regulatory purposes, as well as threat detection and incident response.
Awesome. Yeah, you've had a pretty unique trajectory. You have a fair amount of software engineering in your background, and you've moved into the security space. So you have a slightly different vantage point. And I think, what was interesting about the topic talking to you was, building versus buying. Obviously, there's a concerted shift left within security, which we can also talk about from your perspective. But when you're approaching, build versus buy, just at the high level, maybe you can kind of share what your perspective is, and what are some of the signals for when you'd consider. Actually, well, do you tend to build versus buy when you're evaluating things? That could be actually the best first question.
So I have a computer science background, and I started in the industry as a software engineer, and I have held on to my software engineering and computer science roots throughout my career. So I love building things. It's just part of who I am, what I like to do. So I'm probably biased towards, I get excited when I think about building tools to solve problems. But, we have to be practical and conscientious of our resources that we have to bear, because whatever you build or buy, you have to maintain. That's a consideration. And so I try to just have those conversations with people who probably tend to lean more towards the buy. That helps, balance me when I'm thinking through a build versus buy decision.
Absolutely. So when you're, going through and evaluating a solution, and you're looking at the different perspectives, obviously resourcing is always tight for everyone. When you're looking at the cost potential, capabilities that you could develop, and again, we're not talking. I don't think you're going to be going to build, massive applications. We're talking about tools that are probably relevant to what Greenlight does. Is there a tipping point on ROI where you kind of try to evaluate, the cost of developing it, long-term maintenance if you buy, even versus you build? How do you establish something like that?
So a couple of things that I think about are the speed to get value out of the tooling. And I have these conversations about what would be truly ideal. And a lot of times, what is truly ideal is just not practical in the short term. And so, what's the shortest path to start getting value and leveling up? And if we can write some scripts build versus buy, you can kind of think of it as a spectrum, because there's a range of types of tooling out there. There's open source libraries, open source products, and full blown, enterprise commercial off the shelf products. And so all of those are a consideration. And I try to think about, okay, what's the fastest way to level up significantly to a point that we can sustain and consider that cost and then and provide a place from which we can further grow.
So I guess when you're looking at, obviously you mentioned one of the components to build versus buy is speed to get value out of the tooling. When you're trying to establish that value, that ratio, what goes into defining that?
So yeah, it's the skills we have on the team as well as the support. And so a lot of the teams that I've been on in security, it's been very important and fruitful to partner with the DevOps teams and the cloud infrastructure teams because they have a lot of infrastructure already in place. And if we can leverage that, almost like cloning what we do in a production or a dev environment and clone that into like a security environment space, that we dedicate for security tooling, that might make that build decision easier because we won't have to start from scratch with the tooling just to flesh out the hosting infrastructure. The companies that I've worked for my most recently have been, small and SaaS firms who are 100% in the cloud and fully cloud native. And so, we don't host our own data centers. We use AWS now, but you can't just jump into AWS and then have a ready to go infrastructure. You need to have tooling around deploying things into AWS and tooling around the health of those tools to monitor the uptime and the health and be able to respond when there's an outage. Because inevitably, things break and services go down, just like in production. And so I don't want to be stuck in a position where if we build our own tool and deploy it and then it breaks and we were hoping to rely on it for security purposes and now it's broken and then we don't want a long cycle of getting it back up. So where we can borrow and partner with our friends over in DevOps, SRE, cloud infrastructure, which I feel like we have a really good relationship with those teams now at Greenlight. I try to lean on those as much as possible. That makes it easier to make that build decision. But where I guess one reason to buy tooling is just if you can find a tool that pretty much complete coverage for a pretty big pain point, then yeah, why reinvent the wheel? Some of the other things I look at is certain tools, certain large like enterprise tools tend to kind of rope you as the buyer or the user into their way of operating, like at a business process level. And you have to use their reporting tools, their dashboards, their workflows, their UIs. And I hesitate to buy tools that do that because I found it painful when I have, okay, if I want to do vulnerability scanning, I go to one set of tools and it's just disjoint from, you know, threat monitoring or threat hunting. And that's something else I consider is how easy is it, or practical is it to stitch and weave that tool into our business processes and we control the business process and we dictate what that tool is going to provide value for and how it fits in with how we want to operate.
Yeah, that's interesting because obviously, having the tools fit in, the shift left, trying to incorporate security further into the process versus at the tail end does require different perspective, different tooling. You mentioned your partnership with the DevOps SRE teams. I guess when you're looking at that relationship, and obviously you have a software engineering background, are there initiatives right now at Greenlight that you're focused on kind of helping that shift, or are you guys still potentially, a little bit separate in terms of, the engineering involvement?
We are shifting further left. And I think our various teams and security is within the engineering team at Greenlight, and that helps the partnerships as well. But security, the job's never done, right? You can never achieve perfection, so there's always more to do. We can always do a better job. So, but where we started is we did start with a somewhat of a separation of okay, security. We stood up tools to do basic scanning of our code and our application and our environments. And we defined the format, the workflow, the interface for presenting those results. And we left ourselves room to tweak those results because a lot of scanning tools, and by the way, we started with some basic tools such as NPM audit, and then we built a lot of scripting around that. So that's an example of like building a workflow. We built a scripting around these scanning tools that kind of ingested the data, massaged the data. We left ourselves room to deal with false positives, to make adjustments based on the criticality of the particular asset that was being scanned, and we designed the, I want to say, I guess the inter-team interface for how to present those findings to the development teams and what the expectations are with responding to those findings in terms of, for critical, let's get that done quickly. And then for a high, you have more time to, we stack rank those and focus first on the criticals and then the highs. So we have that critical, high, medium, low priority and ranking. And we have a process and interface for interfacing with presenting that data and allowing those teams to respond. Because even though we try to weed out false positives, when we were first getting started and I was new at Greenlight, when you're new, you have to learn the environment. So we didn't always know exactly what was false positive and what was not. So that fostered those conversations, and then that helps the security team learn, and we can tune our tools better so that we are presenting more and more accurate data over time.
Interesting. I guess just a question when you're looking at obviously, when you're buying something that you're expecting the vendor to bring that expertise in-house, give you capabilities, sometimes that speed, they're going to, they're hopefully an expert in solving whatever pain point you're looking to accommodate or solve. When you're looking to potentially build it from scratch, and you mentioned, a couple of examples of things that you guys started building. How much of that is, hey, we know this, we got to go just build it, or hey, we need to actually set up a sprint or two to actually figure out, get our arms around the problem and really understand it to see if we're biting off more than we can chew.
Yeah, absolutely. We try to be realistic about what we can achieve if we are going to script or build something. And, we have a healthy dose of, well, I do, I have a healthy dose of skepticism when, if it's going to be bringing in a vendor to do custom work, I think there's a lot of due diligence has to go into that. And I take that time into account as well. That's why it's easier to make a decision on a small tool that we can, get maybe open source or we can purchase, that has a very clear goal in life, and it has very clear, and it has programmatic parameters around how to use it and how to integrate it into our ecosystem. So if we find those tools, it's easier to bring those in, because it's easier to reason about how that will fit in. Where we talk about like managed services or large tooling, that if a vendor maybe wants to sell professional services, to me I look at that as like, okay, that means that it's going to take a lot of work to configure, to tune. We might not be able to do it on our own in a timely manner. And so, at least, especially early on, avoided going down that route. But, as we get some wins under our belt, we start small and we grow the program out. We certainly do talk to vendors and try to maintain relationships to be ready to understand when is a good time to maybe pull the trigger on a larger vendor.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess from that perspective, I mean, you have a software engineering background, and if you're going to bring in a vendor to actually, write the code for you, I guess in your mind, you're going to start looking at the time and effort it's going to take for you or your team to go ahead and get something similarly done. Are you in a point in kind of the maturity of your security program where, you would need to bring, in hires to actually add that capability? Or, is it one of those things that you enjoyed so much where you'll roll up your sleeves yourself and, you know, tackle it if necessary?
So I have certainly rolled up my sleeves, especially in the beginning where it was just me. But the team is certainly growing. We have three excellent team members now, and we have open job requisitions now. And but one thing I look for in candidates, that's a bonus, is the willingness to roll up your sleeves and write some code. And with the awareness of, there is writing some scripts just to pull data together for a point project versus writing a tool that we're going to lean on for months to a year. And then in that ability, that there's lots of different takes and opinions on this. I've talked with really good security professionals who don't like to, write code and then throw it away a few months later, right? It feels like a waste. But for me, I'm willing to do that if I can, put bounds on how long it's going to take me to write that code. But right now, we are growing the team, and we have, I think, a good, healthy mix of tendencies and backgrounds, and the tendencies of leaning towards build first versus buy first. And we have that discussion in the team a lot, and I think it's really helpful to have diverse opinions, so that if we all think the same way, then we could fall into that trap of, all right, we got to build everything, and then we don't have anybody to kind of give us a gut check of making us realize why that is not a great idea. And yeah, we haven't done much of bringing external to do things like write code or build tools for us or do like heavy configuration for us.
That makes sense. You have a super unique perspective as well. And I was going to ask you, and I think, I was just thinking while you were talking, this could be a good thing for people listening that, let's say you're a software engineer, you're not inside the security space and you're looking to make a transition into security. You've always had an eye on it. You obviously have made that transition fully. When you're looking back on your career, obviously having a CS degree can be an advantage. I mean, I don't think there's a specific background you need to be in security. I think everyone, can bring their strengths to the table. But for you personally, when you made the transition, was it just, an accident? Did you plan on it? And just kind of curious about that.
Oh, no, I did not plan on it. So I had the opportunity at my first job out of college. They allowed us to enroll in school simultaneously while we continued working. So I was employed at Georgia Tech, and that was just the benefit of being an employee. It was easy to go back to grad school at Georgia Tech. And I got accepted to do a master's in computer science. And, the day of orientation, I'm walking in the building and I see a sign that, oh, they have an orientation for the security program. And I felt, well, I got my undergrad in CS at Tech. I'm very familiar, have some connections. I've been working at the Research Institute. And so I said, let me go check out this security thing because I hear it in the news that it's buzzing and it's a hot industry. So I attended orientation and then I got sold at that point. And I came out of that, went back to my employer, and I just started to convince my employer to let me do actual security work for my day to day job, which was really helpful as well. And so I've had some success with partitioning some of my job duties to focus on security work. And it just ramped up as I got more further through the degree program. And, it took me a few years because I was going part time. But then when it became clear that, I was getting ready to graduate, and then I was able to transition into a security role fully. And, security is so broad. So I was doing, applied research and development. And those contracts were mostly from the federal government. And so my area of research was secure information exchange, federated identity. We've did a lot of work for profiling the SAML specification to allow disparate organizations that had similar missions in law enforcement to connect systems together. So we have an officer in one state law enforcement agency that wants to pull information from another state's information systems. So how do you enable that? How do you enable that officer to reuse their identity and their credentials so that that officer doesn't have to have a prior individual relationship with some external state's resources to access that data? And so that was the context of a lot of the applied research and development that I was a part of. And also got into access control frameworks and privacy frameworks. And I had the opportunity and I took advantage of it to write code that demonstrated the outputs of the research, which I always enjoyed. What I took away from that experience was, at tech and computer science, you get a really strong foundational education. And I got to exercise that and put it into practice, but it was still in a nice R&D environment. I was not on the operational security team at that point, but when I left that job, I went into, operations of actually defending the company's assets. And so, but I've carried the foundational experience and knowledge that I've gained at Tech with me.
Very cool. Definitely an interesting trajectory. And I think a lot of people always, think I'd like to potentially get into, security, and it's a complex area to some. And where you start is always the question. I think you have an interesting story. Hopefully, people can reach out to you and kind of pick your brain in your journey, and maybe they can help change their trajectory. But I was going to say, I'm cognizant of the time, and thank you and appreciate your time for being on and sharing with us. Hopefully, we'll get some people interested in this build versus buy, because I think your perspective from a software engineer is really interesting, and obviously the trajectory your career's taken is also of note. So thanks for sharing.
Absolutely. I enjoyed this. Thanks for being a gracious host.
Absolutely, absolutely. We'll include your LinkedIn on the show notes. I'm sure somebody will want to reach out to you to pick your brain on some of these topics. And that's it for this episode. And we'll be back again with a different guest, different set of topics. Always ask for two things. One, if you find the podcast helpful, share it with somebody else that might be interested in it. That's how the podcast has been growing, and it's been fantastic. And if there is a topic that you want me to find a guest for, just drop me a line on LinkedIn, and happy to go look for a guest that could talk about what you want to hear. Until next time, thanks.